You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Thomas Hager. He's an author of a lot of really super interesting books that I've recently read, such as 10 Drugs, How Plants, Powders, and Pills Have Shaped the History of Medicine. He has also another book, The Demon Under the Microscope, about sulfa drugs, and several other titles that they're really great reads. So, Tom, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, what genre of writing would you call your books? Is it, I guess, scientific history, or what is it?
You know, I think that basically what I'm trying to do is to write books that bring non-scientists, people who don't know a lot about science, or don't like science, or kind of afraid of science, whatever. I'm trying to introduce science to people by telling stories. So what I do is I write books that emphasize human stories that often revolve around science, but they're stories that anybody can listen to and enjoy and relate to. The technical term for what I do is narrative nonfiction, but basically what I'm doing is telling stories about science and medicine.
So what was your first foray into this genre? What got you into it?
Well, I was trained as a scientist. I got a master's degree and was working on a PhD in medical microbiology years and years ago. But I didn't really like and I was very interested in the subject, but I didn't want to spend my life in a laboratory. Personally, it's just not my personality. I get bored, doing the same thing over and over and over. You have to be really, precise, which I appreciate, but I didn't want to spend my life, doing the same thing over and over. So I got out of the laboratory and I went back and learned how to write in a journalism program at the University of Oregon, go Ducks, and then put the two together. So I ended up writing nonfiction about science and history, science and medicine.
And your first book is what, The Demon Under the Microscope?
No, before that, my first real book, I've written about a dozen books in one form or another, but my first big solo book was called Force of Nature. It was a biography of the only American to win 2 unshared Nobel Prizes, and that was Linus Pauling, a chemist. So I got to go meet Linus Pauling, one of the great scientists of our age. Got to go down and talk to him in California several times. Great experience.
That's cool. Okay. And I know this is kind of skipping ahead. We'll come back to the most recent book, but what's on your wish list of topics or books? Are you able to say?
The wish list of future topics? Man, I've got a file about an inch thick with book ideas. I come up with a new book idea about every 2 or 3 days, and I write them down. And I put them in a file. So I've got a ton of stuff. I am working. I will say this: I'm working on a book currently. It's going to be out in about a year. It's about the time when, and this is set back in the 1920s. It was a time when Henry Ford was the richest man in America. Henry Ford, inventor of the Model T, founder of Ford Motor Company, richest man in America, got together with Thomas Edison, who was like the greatest inventor in history. Edison and Ford decided that they were going to build a technological utopian city. They were going to build a very modern, clean energy, new form of currency, like they were going to do away with regular money, um, city in the middle of America that would employ 100,000 people, and it would be a city 75 miles long. It was this huge project. Nobody knows about it. I found out about it, and so that's my next.
Oh wow. Yeah. Well, at least you'll be busy writing for many many years, hopefully. That's great
Well,
that there's so much to talk about.
that's the plan. That's the plan.
Okay. Excellent. Well, let's talk about the latest book is the 10 Drugs book, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So with that book, can you go over just some of the we want people to read it, but what are some of the drugs that really stand out in your mind that you think had an outsized influence on our
Sure.
culture and our society that you want to talk about?
Sure. Like a lot of people, I'm really fascinated with drugs, which I kept finding out surprising stuff about drugs, and I wanted to do a book that talked about kind of like how we got to where we are today with drugs. When you hear a lot about the opioid epidemic, opioid overdose,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And you also hear a lot about new wonder drugs that are doing wonderful things like these monoclonal antibodies that save cancer patients that were unsavable like 5, 10 years ago. So there's stories behind each one of these. What I did was go in and pick 10 groups of drugs that I thought would together tell the whole story about the history of drugs in the world, but particularly in America. And then I found out the stories behind the drugs and put their stories together to tell this larger history. So it's like it's like 10 short stories. Each short story focuses on one really important drug, but does it in a way that tells stories about how the drugs happened and what they've done to our society. It was hard to pick. It was hard to pick 10 because there's about
Yeah.
20,000 drugs that you can buy now, and picking the
Wow.
10 that really mattered was interesting. But anyway, I've got some surprises in there, some things people don't ever think about, and there's some drugs that people will know, like Viagra and statins, very common
Mm-hmm.
drugs. And so it's a mix. It's a mix of stuff, but I think it's entertaining.
Yeah, the most expansive story was opium to opioids to morphine to that was a really cool one that spanned
Yeah,
hundreds of years of history. It was
yeah,
very interesting.
thousands of years of history.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, how much work did it take to write a book like that? Like, what's involved in the research?
Well, the usual thing for a book that I do, because it's pretty heavy. I'm a research fiend. I'm just, I have a bibliography, for stuff for this book, for the 10 Drugs book, hundreds and hundreds of articles and books that I read, and you talk to people, you gather all this information. That takes about a year, of time just to do the research, and then it's about another year to write it, and then you give it to the publisher, and then the publisher takes about a year to get it together, make a book out of it. So it's a 2.5, 3 year process from the time you get started until the time the book shows.
Yeah, I've noticed some scientists that I've spoken to, their books are called textbooks, and then it kind of ruins it and makes it more expensive and inaccessible to the public. So, did you have any back and forth with your publisher? Did they try to classify it as a textbook?
I steer away from writing textbooks because it's a whole different field of publishing. What I do is publish with kind of mainstream, publishers who publish the kind of books you see in bookstores. They're for the general public. They're not for students. Although my books get used in classrooms occasionally, they're not like basic textbooks. And the reason is that I don't write like a textbook. My style is much more, I guess, a popular style. I try and write science stories like they're detective stories or adventure stories or stories of discovery, which is real. I mean, that's part of what science is this sense of adventure and detective work. But I write them the way that you would write a novel. They've got characters and they've got plots, so it's very different than a normal textbook. God bless the textbook writers. I use textbooks all the time for to do my research, but I couldn't write one.
Yeah, no, it's far more interesting the way you write. You focus on the characters and the people behind the drugs and their personalities and the dynamics of their relationships. So it makes it a lot more interesting to read than the textbook for sure.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. So what's any surprising insights that you have that you didn't capture in the 10 drugs book from researching all this? How has it changed your perception of drugs
Yeah.
and how we use them?
Well, the thing that really struck me after doing all this research was the degree to which our lives in America, in particular, because the USA is the world's number one consumer of drugs. And when I say drugs, I'm not talking about illegal drugs. I didn't write about recreational drugs or illegal drugs much in the book. I wrote mostly about pharmaceuticals that are prescribed by doctors, these things that have changed our health habits. What surprised me was the degree to which our lives have come to revolve around drugs in ways that we don't even think about. It's I was surprised, for instance, to find out that people in the USA, take on average over their lifetime probably about 50,000 pills, which is a huge number of pills. And half of Americans take at least one prescription drug, and most of that group take more than one prescription. You got older people who are taking 5 or 10 prescriptions, at a time. And I was really struck by the ways in which they changed not only our health, which they have, our lives are much longer thanks to medicinal drugs, but also the practice of medicine, the way our doctors treat us, the way we treat our own health, even our cultural stuff. For instance, women, women's opportunities, career choices, educational opportunities changed tremendously as a result of a drug in the 1960s, which was the contraceptive pill. It changed culture. It wasn't just health. It changed our culture, our opportunities. So I kept finding out more and more about how important drugs are in our life.
And did you get feedback from readers that was surprising or positive or negative or instructive
Yes.
to you?
I've gotten back a lot of nice feedback from readers. Most readers are great, but I got to tell you, on Amazon there was one review out of the reviews on Amazon that still kind of bugs me because it was the most negative review the book has gotten, and it was written by a guy whose his screen name was Biotech Exec, and he accused the book of being like having like false and misleading information and attacking the pharmaceutical industry, which I went way out of my way not to do. And he
Right.
didn't provide any examples, no examples or anything. That review, but other than that, they've all been great.
Okay, well, that's excellent.
Yeah.
Any of the, I mean, I don't know, has it changed your behavior when you, think about taking prescriptions or not taking them? I mean, you did mention that, you got a note from a hospital saying, oh, you may have a risk of, some kind of condition, but you checked into it yourself and you thought you were probably okay. But
Yeah.
any other changes in your own perception about drugs? Are they?
Yeah.
Do you feel like they're way overprescribed, or depends on the person?
Well, it depends on the person. And, if you've got a medical problem, drugs can be a lifesaver and they're great for millions of people. And they really have extended our lifespans. They're tremendously powerful technologies. But some of them are overprescribed, and drug companies have a way of pushing their products that can sometimes border on the unethical and have sometimes been illegal also. So there's that side of it, the way that drugs are pushed at us on TV, TV ads, and even through our doctors and so on. So there's the good side and bad side. It's like everything, everything is got a good side and a bad side in science, pretty much. And drugs are no exception. No drug, I write in the book, no drug is good, no drug is bad. Every drug is both. In other words, every drug has a good thing that it does for you, and you can misuse it or you can suffer a negative side effect. Every drug has side effects, so you don't get the good without the bad. Every drug is both good and bad, and I think that's important for people to remember. I feel like I'm a more educated consumer now because
True.
of the research that I did for the book, so I'm able to judge better which drugs I'm going to take and which drugs I'm not going to take.
There was one statement you made in the book which, like, it just made me crack up laughing. I don't know if I'll say it right, but you said something like this. It was like drug companies up until this point were used to finding chemical solutions for things and not biological. They weren't geared up to
to I guess consider or use biology in order to to create drugs to help people with medical problems. And that's how I phrase it. I thought that's insane. How could you to create drugs and things to help people who are biological, you don't consider the biology and you don't think that it just blew my mind when I heard that.
Yeah, no, the difference is, certainly drugs, let's go back, say, 50 years. Before that time, most drugs were chemicals that were derived from plants often or in the lab, made in the laboratory. So the drugs themselves were chemicals. They were called small molecule drugs. They were tended to be pretty small compared to the size of the molecules that you make in your own body. Molecules you make in your own body tend to be ginormous compared to most older drugs. And so the switch happened starting about 50 years ago toward medicines that were based on biological molecules. So the difference is in the old days they were small molecule chemicals, and now they're manipulating biological molecules like antibodies and enzymes and genes that have medicinal effects. And that's a biological shift to where the medicine itself is biological. All of them act on your body, which is a biological system. So that part is absolutely the same. Ultimately their effects are biological, but the sources used to be more chemical, and now a lot of hot new drugs are what we call biologicals, which are molecules very similar to the ones produced in your own body. They're much larger, they act in a different way, and but they are biological in order.
And I guess that's it's not obvious, and that's a super important distinction in how medicine has changed recently.
Yeah, it has. The other thing about biologicals and that shift is that biologicals often tend to be more expensive. So, the biological I deal with most in the book is called monoclonal antibodies. Monoclonal antibodies are a big deal now. There's 6 out of the top 10 biggest selling drugs, biggest money makers in the drug world are now monoclonal antibodies. These are biologicals that didn't exist, 50 years ago, but are now this, more than half of the biggest selling drugs are these biologicals. But they make so much money in part because they're so expensive to take. You hear about people who have serious disease who want a monoclonal antibody. Sometimes they have to spend, enormous amounts of money to get a year's worth of treatment, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for these drugs. So that's there's a plus and a minus to biologicals.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've heard some treatments can be hundreds of thousands of dollars for certain cancers. I mean, do you see the price of them coming down at all to a feasible level for the average person, or no?
I hope that they do, and I imagine that they will. The history of drugs is they often start out being more expensive than they end up because people. It has to do with patent laws and how long a drug company can charge whatever it wants for a drug before it goes generic. Before other people can make that same drug. So this is a hot field. A lot of changes legally in that way, but I would imagine that monoclonals will come down.
I would hope so. Otherwise, it would be difficult to then have any widespread use. So expensive,
They are so expensive, but they make a lot of money for the drug companies for sure because they can charge so much. They're very specialized medicines, and that's a shift that has happened fairly recently. Just with that class of drugs, these monoclonal antibodies, they're used for highly really serious life-threatening diseases like cancer. Or debilitating diseases like arthritis and joint inflammation. They are tremendously expensive because people are in serious trouble when they get prescribed them, and they and their insurance companies figure out that it's worth the money to save a life. But that's the history of drugs is mostly concerned with less expensive drugs that often do save lives, but very often don't save a life at all. You mentioned statins. I wrote a chapter on statins, which are very inexpensive drugs. A lot of people are taking statins. Millions and millions of people are taking statins to lower their cholesterol. And those drugs are very inexpensive. They occasionally save a life, but my research showed that most of the people who haven't had heart disease already, who are taking statins, might not get the benefit they think they're going to get out of it. So it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. Are there any up and coming treatment protocols or drugs that you didn't have time to put into the book, but you know about because of your research?
Well, I mentioned some things coming down the pipeline. I mentioned drugs that have digital sensors in them because they're developing tablets now or capsules that have a tiny little electronic sensor in them that will send out a signal when the drug is dissolved in your body. It's a way of tracking the fact that you've actually taken the drug, which is used when in especially in the it has potential use in patients who don't remember. Often, like older patients, might not remember to take their pill when they should, and they can now track when the pill has been taken and remind the person to take the drug and stuff like that. So there's stuff in the pipeline that's coming down that's going to be pretty interesting. But one thing I saw in the book was that, in the research for the book, is that there's always surprises. There's always stuff you don't know about that's going to come out of left field, might be huge. So there's are very difficult to predict.
Okay. Yeah, I wonder with drugs that can track whether you take them or not, if we'll discover that compliance and taking drugs is much lower than we thought, or if it'll lead to insurance companies demanding that if you don't adhere to it and take it, then they're not going to subsidize it. I mean, it's a whole, I guess, many cans of worms that could open up.
It certainly does. But it's part of, it goes along with the whole move toward a more and more surveillance of your daily activities kind of thing. See where it would be really beneficial for people who are supposed to take a drug but don't. That sounds to me like a real benefit. But then on the other hand, they could track your drug taking activity with almost anything.
Interesting. So are there any books that you have in your list that you don't think will ever get written that you think need to be written, or any topics that you'd love to cover but for some reason you don't see yourself doing it in the near future?
Well, I think that food production is a huge issue for our species. We're in the last stages of this huge population explosion. It's been going on for about 100, 150 years now, in which our population has been shooting up and up and up and up. So around 1900, there were about 1 billion people on Earth. Now there's 7 billion plus, and it's going to keep going up to about 10, 11 billion in the next 50 years or so. That is a huge issue. One part of that issue is how are we going to feed everybody without destroying the Earth, the ecosphere, our biological systems? How are we going to be able to feed another 3 billion people? A 50% increase in world population coming up very quickly. How are we going to feed them all? I think that's a huge topic, and I'm fascinated with that. So far, I haven't been able to get a publisher to publish a book about it, but I'm hoping.
Do you sense any, the guiding hand of the publishers, or the things that are popular right now, or things that they want published, and things that they don't? Any insights there?
For aspiring book writers out there?
I'm just wondering, I'm just wondering, I guess, what needs to be written about that maybe isn't being written about, in your opinion. But you've already covered that. So.
Well, the deal with book publishing is publishers will publish stuff if they think people are interested enough to buy the book. So they want to be able to sell their books, same way drug company wants to be able to sell drugs. They're in business to sell books. They have to publish books that people will buy, and so they're always looking for topics that are hot. Food production is sort of like wonkier and not as sexy as a lot of topics. So I think that it's a more difficult sell for a writer like me to sell a publisher on a book like that, because they're looking for something that might sell a few more books a little faster, and that's their business. I don't blame them at all.
Yeah, another quick question. When you write, some of the stuff you're writing about is maybe happened 50 years ago. Some is very contemporary, but some of it's very old, like when he talks about opium, etc.
Yep.
Is it a lot harder to get information on things that happened, a couple hundred years ago, or even longer? And how do writers even find that stuff?
Well, the research process, as I told you, I'm a demon for research, and the research process is fascinating. There's a million ways to go about it, and I will tell you though that from my experience writing a lot of history, it's sometimes there's some things that are easier about getting old information rather than new information. A lot of recent information in the drug world is proprietary. It's kept by these corporations, and it's hard to get to because they don't want they're worried about bad publicity. They don't want anything negative to get out there, and so they tend not to share a lot of current information. However, historically, you can use stuff that's been published about companies in the past. They have less of an interest in that and protecting that. So some of it's more accessible. Some of the older stuff is more accessible, and so it's kind of a conundrum. I mean, it's a big issue, but there's the downside of historical research is that a lot of times the records have been destroyed or they were never kept in the first place. So it's a little harder, takes more work to put together a really good story about the past sometimes. But it's possible.
Yeah, I wondered how people write history books, especially on really, really old things. How do you find all that stuff? How do you find all that info?
It varies.
Some people told me, people used to write a lot more letters, which they did, and it's in some ways it's easier, like you said. In some ways it's harder.
Yeah, that's right, and it is true that there were letters, but a lot of them have been lost. So it's a trade-off, and sometimes you really have to dig hard in places that people don't usually look. Like my deal is that if I'm say working with old records from a company, I was The Demon Under the Microscope was a book I did about sulfa drugs that were developed at the Bayer Corporation in Germany in the 1920s, 1930s. And I flew to Germany in order to get the story. I flew to Germany and into the Bayer Corporation and to the corporate archivist that kept this enormous room full of old records. It was like that scene in Raiders from the Lost Ark where they go into
Wow.
this huge warehouse. It wasn't quite that big, but it was big, and it was stuffed with all the corporate records because the corporation felt it necessary to keep them. But they gave me free run of that place, and I got to look up all kinds of interesting stuff. So it varies from project to project.
That's cool. I guess there are thousands of repositories of knowledge that it's very difficult to get access to.
Well, and you have to think about getting access to it. You have to consider all of the possibilities. A lot of records are kept in university libraries. A lot of records are kept in historical societies. Some records are kept in old county courthouses. If you've got a hot project and you want the information, you can often find.
I guess there's the whole method of research itself that you've kind of had to figure out over time to do this.
That's right. And it's just lucky that I've got that science side in me. The science side is endlessly curious about everything and willing to do a little work to find an answer. So I'm willing to do I'm willing to do the research work because I love it, and do the digging. I think it really does make for better books.
Yeah, oh, definitely, definitely. Well, like I said, I can tell listeners, my experience was they were delightful. I listened to them in audiobook, like I told you, and they were super interesting to listen to. They weren't like a textbook at all, and I learned all kinds of stuff. Like I learned now the atmosphere in Germany from 1900 up to World War II, and I saw why and how where Hitler came from, and all the social dynamics and everything through reading one of your books, and it was really fascinating.
That's cool. I'm really glad to hear that because that's another thing people don't think about. You sort of think like science is separate from everything else. These scientists are like in their laboratories and they're not part of the bigger life we lead and stuff. But that's not true. Science is kind of woven in with everything. It's economics, money, business practices, political history, cultural history. It all is wound around in science, which makes it more interesting for me than to think of it as being somehow, off in some ivory. It's not. It is vital to our lives, the way we live day to day. It's just like central to who we are, and yet very few people think about where it came from, how these discoveries happened, and so forth. So it's cool that that you got a little other sort of side information along the way. That's great.
Yeah, it was also interesting the consequence of various people's discoveries. Some of them had ruined their lives. Some of them had brought them great fame, and then their lives are ruined. So it's weird how the science reflects back on the person that figured it out and changes their life so dramatically.
Yeah, it does, and that's that makes for a good story because if you find a flawed inventor or discoverer, a scientist where you can make their personal life come alive to show that these scientists are real people too. They sometimes do suffer from their discoveries, and sometimes they get rich and famous, and sometimes they get alcoholic and suicidal. So it's all over the map, and that's what keeps it interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, excellent. So your new book, 10 Drugs, it's on Amazon, Audible, Kindle, everywhere books are sold, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And where can listeners find out and see like your whole library of books? All the titles maybe in one place and find out more.
Sure. The best place probably my website, which is thomashager.net, ThomasHagr.net, and that has all my stuff and background and so forth. And you can, if you put my name, if you put Thomas Hager into Google, you'll find it.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Tom, thanks for coming. It's been a really interesting call. I appreciate it, and keep writing books as fast as you can.
All right. Thank you. Good to be on.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.